Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking around. I'm incredibly excited to chat with y'all about how we can use AI and diversity, and also how we shouldn't really be using AI. A little bit about me. I'm a data scientist. I've been working in data science and AI for the last 6 years. A lot of my time has been spent building product user models, so understanding user behavior, churn, app downloads, trying to predict these things for obviously business reasons. I spent the last couple years really focused on AI and trying to make sure that we have fairer AI in place. I'm incredibly excited about this because there are so many opportunities for AI in DEI, but we have to be really careful about how we use that. A little bit about what we'll go over today. So first and foremost, there is regulation in the space of AI and how it's used in hiring. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of the pitfalls, some of the ways we misuse AI unintentionally, and then we'll go over some of the opportunities we have to increase DEI. So first and foremost, recent law passed by New York City, local New York City and companies who hire New York City residents, it's actually going to be really impactful for AI overall. So what this states is that if a company is using an automated decision tool, so in the screening of applicants or any time during that hiring process, that algorithm actually has to be audited by a third-party, unaffiliated organization. And then it also requires that companies are public about this information, that they're transparent, and that they allow customers, they allow users, new candidates to review the results of this bias audit even before they apply. It has to be publicly listed on their website. And even though this is pretty local to New York City, we can expect that more regulation like this is coming. As AI is starting to be used in so many more industries and used in ways that maybe it wasn't intended to be used in, we're going to see a lot more regulation, and companies need to start thinking about what they're going to do. So first we'll start out with the pitfalls. So like I mentioned, AI is being adopted in so many new ways. There's ways that we can use AI that aren't really as fair. So when we talk about avoiding the harms of AI, one of the biggest issues is the fact that we conflate it with software engineering consistently. Unfortunately, AI is far more complex. There are so many more hyperparameters we can change that we can't really say it's a one-to-one comparison with traditional software. Because of that, there are certain things we need to be doing differently. The first thing we have to really understand is that model development is never really done and completed. It's not like going through the typical software engineering process and then a project is done, launched, and kind of existing maybe with some maintenance. Instead, AI has a lot more involved in that. So let's say we wanted to use AI to find the best candidates for a specific job. The only way that system is actually going to learn and improve is if it has some feedback exactly about how it was wrong or how it was right. And what's difficult about this is that, especially in HR, we have to do this in a way that's very close with our business partners and very close with our recruiters. So let's say someone goes through the pipeline, they apply to this job. We have to tell our system that they were either a good match for the role or they were a bad match for the role in order for that system to actually improve. So this modeling process is never kind of just one and done and able to be in production or as a feature on a platform without some sort of continual learning. Another issue here is that resumes are not as neutral as we think they are. So a really popular example, Amazon spent years working on this platform to help hire candidates a little bit easier, speed up the process. But what they found is that their algorithm was discriminating against women based off of things that we wouldn't exactly consider as really obvious. So if you went to a women's college, if you were the captain of the Lady Cats, those things were actually encoded and understood by the algorithm as factors of gender, and it started to not recommend a lot of women for these roles. to the point that they actually had to scrap this entire project. So while we tend to think of a resume as fact, we tend to think of it as it's a pure representation of a candidate's qualifications. An AI system doesn't look at it the same way. A lot of systems don't have the context that a human might have when looking at a resume and saying, okay, you may have gone to a women's college, but that doesn't exclude you from a role. And then unfortunately, AI is just a really advanced version of pattern recognition. This means that any historical patterns, if an AI has been trained on historical data that includes biased decisions, it's just going to replicate those biased decisions. There's no contextualizing that an AI can do to understand that we should maybe balance out for a male-dominated industry. But these are things that we can constrain AI to do, and we'll talk about those a little bit more in the opportunity section. Another problem that we tend to do with AI systems is use things like personality and personality types and over-rely on those. So when I say that, I mean that you can take a personality test, you can get results, and instead of trying to assess an individual based off of exactly what we know about them, once they have a specific label, they tend to be categorized, they tend to be looked at only by that label and not by other metrics. So an example of that is people who are introverts. There are plenty of introverts who happen to work in sales, but once you're categorized as an introvert, an AI system may not recommend you for a sales role. One of the things we have to also recognize as a society is that it's easy for us to label things, put them in boxes. But that's not exactly how real life works. We can't say no introverts are going to be looked at for a job in sales or marketing. And we tend to just kind of boil down, unfortunately, all the aspects of a human being to one or more labels. And that's not really helpful for us. So we have to make sure that we're not looking at just personality and looking at a candidate's overall qualifications. And another aspect, unfortunately, here is productivity scoring. So I think as a huge result of the pandemic, employers want a better idea of how employees are spending their time, the way we manage time, what we're spending time on. But this unfortunately tends to be really biased towards people of color, people who are single parents. There are so many reasons why you may not be at your desk 24/7, or why the metrics don't show your real work. It also doesn't include things like live events. If you spend your time building relationships with clients, these are things that can't really be tracked. And so unfortunately, our over-reliance on wanting to put a number to someone's work ethic or to their input to an organization is something, again, that AI tends to pick up and get a little bit wrong. So enough of the negative. Those are some of the things that we can avoid, but we have so many opportunities with AI as well. I think a huge precursor to that, though, is understanding that there are policies that should be in place prior to using AI for DEI efforts. And I think a huge aspect here is that these policies should already be helping us in the DEI space. It's really hard to decide to adopt AI into your workflow or adopt AI into your organization for these purposes, but not really have the groundwork down. So policies should be in place that both, one, are either currently working, and we should also have policies that allow us to train our employees to really understand AI systems. So when we talk about AI adoption, there's always a very steep learning curve, and people may assume that you have to understand the details about neural networks, when that's not really the case. In fact, it's that people who are working in recruiting should have an understanding of how the algorithms they interact with, let's say on a hiring platform, we should have an understanding of how they work. We should have an understanding of what to look for when it comes to bias. And we should have an understanding of what to speak out about. Do we notice issues with this system? Are you getting consistently biased candidate recommendations? So these policies should be in place before adopting AI. And here's some recommendations. So not all of these policies will apply to every organization, but I think by starting with policies that are truly aimed at equity. So first, really just trying to include underestimated candidates in the hiring process and making sure to interview at least one before making a decision on a role. The other policies here are really about incentivizing, at least monetary incentives for referrals, are also an area where confirmation bias tends to sneak in. It's a statistic that I think it's 75% of white people have 100% white networks. So when you go to your college friends and you recommend them for roles, this is one of the major ways we tend to see this selection bias, because people who are closer to you are going to be more likely very similar to you. And unfortunately, this referral system hasn't really helped us in the state of DEI. And a couple of the other policies here are really just focused on general equity and making sure that we have something in place before we add additional tools to our workflows. So speaking specifically about where AI helps us, we can really actually improve the demographics of the candidates who apply to roles by attempting to de-gender or remove some of the gender biases from our job descriptions. There have been studies that show that various types of words have kind of a discrepancy in the types of people who are triggered to apply. So a lot of roles that are listed as requiring someone to be results-driven tends to attract more men to apply to these roles than women. And so there are several tools that we can use that go through a job description and they start to make better recommendations for us. So rather than saying results-driven, we could say something like team-oriented or collaboration-driven, and that would actually make a difference in the demographics of the people who apply to these roles. AI can also help us by anonymizing this process. So there's some tools that are able to change your voice and make it seem like in voice videos that gender's kind of taken away. So by having a more neutral voice in phone calls, that's actually been shown to reduce the amount of bias in this process as well. AI can also help us when we are trying to make decisions about who is really a good candidate. There are tools that really allow us to have a better insight and attempt to get a good idea of a candidate's overall qualifications rather than just looking at a couple things that aren't necessarily indicative of their success in a role. And a huge point here is recognizing that responsible AI is the new way forward. So we might have heard about AI ethics. There's a lot of work in fairness and bias, but there's enough regulation coming that we have to recognize that using AI is incredibly important for fairness. And there's, especially in hiring, there are EEOC compliance, there are a lot of drivers for fairness, but we have to recognize that we can't continue down the path that we've been continuing down, which has unfortunately just led us to really unfair consequences. And we're gonna start seeing organizations get penalized by this, by fines for not being compliant with a lot of local regulation. Another great area for the use of AI is in trying to find diverse candidates. So AI can be helpful when we are trying to understand social networks or understand how people are congregating on the internet. And so many amazing talent actually are in identity networks that aren't really on the forefront of a lot of minds for recruiters. So a huge aspect here is being able to go through social media, go through different websites and really understand where people who are talented are online. They may not just be on LinkedIn, sorry. They may be in other groups that, if you're not a member of that specific identity, it may be a little bit harder for you to find. And AI also helps us in the auditing process. So there are really amazing cutting edge tools like reinforcement learning that allow us to look at the entire potential space of algorithms and help us decide which algorithms are the most helpful, but also are the most fair. So they tend to balance the business benefits with also not discriminating against specific races and genders and all protected classes. One thing I wanted to point out was that this is a phenomenal interactive game you could play to understand how complex AI is. So it's called Survival of the Best Fit. I encourage everyone to try this out. It allows you to basically be the AI recruiter and try to make the right decisions. So just a couple final thoughts here. AI can be incredibly helpful, especially for finding diverse candidates. It can be helpful in allowing us to audit our AI systems even better. So yes, we use AI to fix biased AI at times. But we have to just be careful about how we're labeling and classifying people and make sure that we use AI and DEI with the right groundwork laid. All right. Thank you guys so much. I'm excited to chat a little bit more.
Thank you so much, and apologies for the microphone issue.
No worries.
I was ready for you to start singing. It was So. Good afternoon or morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Kist. I'm LinkedIn's Global Director for Inclusion Recruiting. I have to be honest, when I was asked to facilitate and moderate this discussion, having spent 20 years in DEI and talent acquisition, I was a little skeptical and probably continue to have a little bit of skepticism as it pertains to AI and the positive impacts. As you started talking through the legal landscape and the pitfalls and all of those things, I'm sure there's probably some folks in the audience who might have skepticism as well. What would you say to someone like me or someone in the audience who may have a little bit of that healthy skepticism?
Yeah, first I would say that skepticism is good, and we should probably have a little bit more of that when we think about how we implement AI. I think what's nice is that the overall picture is that it's not all doom and gloom. There are so many ways to use AI for positive reasons. One of the things that's actually been tossed around a lot recently is being able to retract AI systems, so pulling them out of production when we've found bias. I think the big takeaway is that we shouldn't necessarily accept the status quo, and we should be working to use AI in positive ways and then maybe pull back if we find that there is bias or discrimination.
Right. And I guess the other piece would probably be that not using AI because we're afraid there may be bias would presuppose that there isn't already bias in our systems.
Absolutely.
So in some ways, it's moving us along the continuum.
Yes, and I think a huge point there is really just enhancing human decision-making, not putting the decision 100% solely on an AI system, but actually having that be one of many inputs a human would make in their decision-making process. It's not about necessarily taking the job or really taking full responsibility, but enhancing how we are able to hire and hopefully reducing bias in that process.
I love that. So for those in the audience who are in talent acquisition, if you kind of break it down to its essence, what we do is we attract, we identify, we assess, and we close. In that sort of model, where is AI most positively impactful in the process?
I think it's really in the identification process and also within screening.
Okay.
But being able to, or I'm sorry, attracting as well. Like I mentioned with various different community groups, various identity-based groups, the ability to attract diverse talent is really where I think AI is the most beneficial. Rather than attempting to find something wrong with a candidate, you're attempting to find candidates that you wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. When you talked at the end about sort of, for lack of a better term, auditing your process, is that really looking at the assessment process and looking to see where you may have, for lack of a better term, adverse impact on a certain demographic, or how does that work?
Absolutely. So the auditing makes sure that there is an adverse impact. There are several different fairness metrics that we can look at, but AI helps us understand the entire space of models. So if we had a plane, I'm going to make this a little bit more nerdy and technical, but if we had a plane and every model exists at some point in this plane, so a model that's biased towards men, biased towards women, we can use AI to identify which ones have the least amount of bias. And I think that's the most compelling aspect in the auditing space is that if you can legally defend that you chose the fairest algorithm, most orgs are in a really good place.
Yeah. So I think a lot of, as you're talking, my skepticism is through lack of understanding. Candidly, when you said plane, I thought we were flying and not on a vertical plane, so my apologies. I got excited. I was like, ooh. We only have a couple of minutes left. For this audience and for people like myself who clearly need to come along for the ride, what do you want us to leave this room with? Like, as a person who is talking to a large group of talent acquisition leaders, what do you want them to leave with?
Yeah, I would say an enthusiasm for new technology used in the right way. I have a couple companies kind of listed on the slides that are using AI to either anonymize the process, are using AI to de-bias some of the ways we tend to write job descriptions. I think there's so much amazing technology going on and so much innovation currently that we don't have to assume it's all about, it is not all harmful. Right. Is I think the big thing in being able to research and investigate ways to adopt these things into your workflow, adopt these things into your organization, with skepticism, but without fear that it is just going to immediately lead to negative consequences.
I like that. Skepticism without fear.
Yes,
I like that. That feels like a good place to wrap. Thank you so much. This has been incredibly informative. I will leave at least 40% less skeptical than when I walked up here, so that's pretty good for me. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and we'll hang out afterwards if you want to ask questions, mostly of Ayodele and less of me.
Thank y'all so much.
With that, thank you so much.